We are going to keep our discussion of muscle physiology going and think about it through the lens now of how we prescribe exercise in order to make a change in skeletal muscle. So, this is a figure that we ended our last lecture with. We had our patient who had chronic upper back and neck pain. You do this evaluation and you determine that there's weakness in scapular muscles. And now, hopefully, we have kind of a working understanding of the skeletal muscle physiology that all came together to contribute that force output. Whether it was the size of the muscle, how much ATP was made available, the neural drive to that muscle, the ability to deliver blood to that muscle, all of that is playing a role when you go to do a test and measures manual muscle testing and see how strong that patient is. So you have identified a weakness, you found the muscle where there's weakness, you might even have some pretty good ideas of the physiology of why they're weak. So let's now talk about prescribing a very specific exercise to target the problem, to make a difference on this muscular weakness with exercise. So this is a very generic description of how you create an exercise prescription. And this is kind of going to be in the framework of almost every prescription that you put together for your patients. You should include some kind of a warm-up, somewhere between 5 to 10 minutes of light to moderate activity that warm the body up to get ready for the conditioning phase, whether that's aerobic or resistance or a neuromotor re-education plan. That's the meat of your exercise, followed by a cool down to kind of bring that patient's physiology naturally back down to a resting state. And then maybe ending with some mild stretching, kind of taking advantage of the heat that you created. So I really want to dive into what each of these components of the exercise prescription is actually giving your patient. And the first thing I want to talk about is the warm-up, because this has a really huge physiological effect. And I think sometimes it can be taken for granted, or maybe you don't think about all that it's doing for your patients. So I just want to spend a little time on what that warm-up does, because there's going to be certain patient populations that really benefit from that warm-up and might be much more successful in therapy, get more out of the exercise prescription you are trying to apply, or even able to do more in that conditioning phase if just given the proper warm-up. So what does spending 5 or 10 minutes out of your exercise time doing a warm-up actually give the patient? The first thing that it does is when we exercise, we activate our sympathetic nervous system. That's just in the ballgame. Every time you exercise, you get a hit of sympathetic nervous system activation. So what does activation of the sympathetic nervous system do to our physiology? What is that giving us in terms of making us better at doing exercise? If you are on board with doing a little active learning in this remote setting, I'd like you to pause the video and see if you could write down everything the sympathetic nervous system does to your physiology. Give yourself a little quiz so you know what you have to focus on when you study. Hit pause and write down what it does. If you're coming back to the video now, you should have written down what the knowledge base you're bringing into this class on what the sympathetic nervous system does. So let's talk about the heart. What does the sympathetic nervous system do to the heart? Well, we've got direct neural innervation to increase heart rate and increase contractility. What does that do for our patient? Well, it's increasing cardiac output. So if you give your patient a warm-up, they will have a greater cardiac output at the time when they start the conditioning phase. Really important for patients that might have some deficits in that area. What does it do in the lungs? This can be a tricky one. Sympathetic nervous system relaxes the bronchi. It increases the diameter of your airways. It makes it easier for us to get air in and out. This can be really critical for anyone who has like restrictions in moving air, especially like asthmatics that might have constricted bronchi, to give that time to let the sympathetic nervous system open up the airways. If you wrote down on your list that it increases respiratory rate, cross that off, put a big X through it. The control of respiratory rate is much more complex than just simply when you have sympathetic activation, you increase your rate. It's a much more intricately controlled system, so it is not one of the effects of the sympathetic nervous system. I like this little guy here on our picture. You can see there's a direct neural innervation of that adrenal medulla. So if the sympathetic nervous system is activated, you're going to get greater amounts of circulating epinephrine. So you'll have more of an effect of the sympathetic nervous system ready to go at the time of the conditioning exercise. So these, I kind of just highlighted the ones that were really important to exercise on this list, but I missed one big one. What is the sympathetic response in a blood vessel? Write it down real quick. What do you think it does? Sympathetic nervous system, what does it do? How does a blood vessel respond? If you wrote vasoconstriction, you are right. And that might feel very strange because exercise, we must have more blood flow. But in fact, the sympathetic nervous system causes a vasoconstriction. But it is true that if you look at the total amount of blood flow, as you increase the rate of metabolism, you are going to increase blood flow to the muscle. And this is known as active hyperemia. So when we exercise, there is increased blood flow to working skeletal muscle, but it is not driven by a central regulator. By that I mean it's not the sympathetic nervous system that's just flooding every blood vessel in your body. In fact, the sympathetic nervous system vasoconstricts everywhere, and only those active muscles get increased blood flow. This is a landmark study that shows this. Oops, and I have some, come back. Oh, it's not going to let me right now. This is a landmark study that showed this phenomenon. So what you're looking at here is on the y-axis, you have blood flow going to the forearm. So they had sensors on the forearm measuring how much blood flow was going. And you can see there was a period of time at rest where they just measured the blood flow in the arm. Then, kind of right here at this time point here, they started a lower extremity exercise. They hopped on a bike and they started pedaling. So when they started the exercise, you should get a big hit of sympathetic nervous system, right? Get that body going, get the heart rate going, dilate the bronchi. But they continued to measure the blood flow in the arm. And what they found was that when you started exercising the lower extremity, resting muscle that was not involved in the activity had a decreased blood flow. Look, it's lower than at rest if you compare the two. This was very surprising to people because you'd think the response to exercise should increase blood flow. Where when the muscle they were measuring wasn't working, there was actually a vasoconstriction that happened. The blood flow in the arms went down, which probably helped facilitate blood flow to the lower extremities. They tested their experimental design by then having them, at this time point here, they had them start doing forearm exercise. So they continue to measure blood flow in the arm. And when they did forearm exercise, whoa, look what happens to blood flow. When the forearm is the muscle that's exercising, they got this massive increase in blood flow. So this is one of the key studies that showed that you do not have a systemic effect that causes increased blood flow everywhere, but rather you have local control that allows you to deliver blood flow right where you need it. So this is a graph that shows blood flow distribution at rest. And it should make sense. You can kind of see muscle or blood going to where you need it a lot in our gut at rest because we have got a lot of GI activity. The liver, the kidney are getting a really high percentage of cardiac output. Let's see, skeletal muscles here. It's kind of a, on the pie chart, it's kind of relatively small amount is going to our skeletal muscle at rest. So we don't have a huge demand or need there. Compare that to maximal exercise. And again, the pink is the skeletal muscle. 88% is now going to skeletal muscle, really at the expense of the others, right? We vasoconstrict everywhere, and the muscle that is metabolically active causes a local vasodilation to help deliver the oxygen to the metabolically active tissue during exercise. I love this picture of blood vessels where you can actually see the red blood cells within the vessel. I like this just to think about the power of vasodilation. So here you can see a blood vessel that has just almost a single red blood cell being able to go through at a time. It's so small. Where if you increase the diameter, you can see a much larger grouping of red blood cells getting through, and you can imagine the huge difference in oxygen delivery between these two options. So if during exercise, there isn't a central commander sending blood to one area or the other, and rather there's somehow a local control, it kind of makes you wonder how we do it. So I'd like to just give you a minute to think this through, because this is a really important phenomenon, especially because so much of what we do with exercise and as PTs is trying to get blood flow to a certain area to help with healing or strengthening or a whole number of other factors. So when the human physiology was first created, it could have been designed that we actively pumped blood to where we needed it when we needed it. Like the brain could be in charge of it. And if you think about that and compare that to kind of how we deliver water to a whole city, right? We could have it where we're actively pumping water into every house at every moment, and in every sink in your house right now, water was just rushing by. And when you needed to brush your teeth, you just walked up and stuck your toothbrush in the running water, brushed your teeth, and then left your house, and all day long water went draining through your house. This would work when you needed it. Water would be there if you had enough water to possibly supply that. But holy cow, the waste, right? Like just tons of water being wasted. And if you're talking about the human physiology, what would your blood volume have to be to actually have blood just perfusing every part of your body exactly at the amount that it would need when it was maximally activated at rest? Totally inefficient system for human physiology as well as for a city. So what do cities do? They take all the water, right, and they put it up way up high in a water tower. What does that give us? What's the power there? Well, by taking all the water and putting it up high, there's this huge pressure gradient, right? A driving pressure of water, because gravity wants to pull all that water down. And then at the end of every pipe and every hose, there is a faucet, right? That's closed. And when you don't need water, you just close the faucet. The pressure behind the faucet's still there. So at the moment when you need to brush your teeth, all you have to do is open the spigot, and the driving pressure is there behind your faucet, and the water comes out. You use just the amount that you need, and then you close it back off again. And that is very much the same way we do it in human physiology. So blood flow is equal to the change in pressure over resistance. So if we are talking about how do we control where blood flow goes, blood flow is the regulation that we're talking about. How do we pick? How do we pick the tissue over here that gets less and the tissue over here that gets more? Well, we have to have a driving pressure, a constant driving pressure behind that flow, and that's going to be our delta P. That is our arterial blood pressure. And at rest, we keep our arterial blood pressure extremely stable. We have that resting driving pressure at all times. If we lose blood pressure, right, that is going into circulatory shock, and that's a serious medical condition. The priority of our system is to maintain this driving pressure in our arterial system. And that means that the control is the faucet, is our ability to turn a section on or off by changing the diameter of the system. So if blood flow is equal to delta P over resistance, and we look at the factors that go into resistance, This equation is, so we kind of extrapolated into this original equation what the resistance is, so I can draw your attention here. Resistance is made up of a constant for the math equation. N is the viscosity of the blood, and viscosity of the blood would change flow. That isn't normally something that we change acutely during exercise. So viscosity we can almost think of as staying constant. L is the length of the tube. So the length of our blood vessel doesn't change acutely when we need more blood flow. So that leaves us with the radius of the blood vessel. And what's really interesting when you look at the equation, the radius of the blood vessel is raised to the 4th power. So the tiniest little change in the diameter of the blood vessel has a huge impact on the total change in blood flow. So the faucet in the human physiological system is the diameter of the blood vessel. And when we don't need blood to go somewhere, let's say when we're exercising, we do not need blood going to our GI system to help us digest our breakfast. We vasoconstrict and we turn the faucet off there. And right where we need all that blood, in the skeletal muscles, the local metabolism of that system causes a vasodilation, and we can deliver tons of blood right where we need it. This system gives us ultimate control without excessive amounts of volume needed. Like, we can actually have a pretty low total blood volume and still deliver blood at these really maximum outputs during exercise. And it's not some complicated neural network that needs all these different receptors and transporters and pathways to know where all this goes. It's all handled at the local tissue. You turn the faucet on when you need it, and you turn the faucet off when you don't need it. So when I talk about local factors, what I'm really talking about is something called metabolic regulation. That means that local metabolism is the trigger for the changes in blood vessel diameter. And this is so cool to me because we're going to talk a lot more about cellular metabolism in this class. But if you've talked about it before, you already know there's a lot of waste products in cellular metabolism. You make a lot of carbon dioxide. Well, if carbon dioxide goes up, it actually stimulates vasodilation. Isn't that cool? Like, when you're making a waste product, your body's like, oh, we're making a lot of waste over here. We better vasodilate and deliver more blood. Lactate, we're going to talk about lactate as a big indicator of when you're running the metabolic pathways that don't use oxygen. That's a big cellular trigger that, hey, maybe I don't have enough oxygen in this system. It's a vasodilator. Adenosine is a vasodilator. Does that word sound familiar? Adenosine is the A of ATP, adenosine triphosphate. So when you're blowing through ATP, you are releasing adenosine, which is a potent vasodilator. Histamine, prostaglandin, some big vasodilators. If pH is dropping, vasodilation occurs. So local factors that are being released from skeletal muscle when that tissue is metabolically active actually cause a local vasodilation, which is the trigger to increase blood flow and increase oxygen delivery. The term for this is functional sympatholysis, meaning that local factors such as carbon dioxide and adenosine and lactate and potassium override the vasoconstrictor signal that the sympathetic nervous system is giving. Okay, so here's your sympathetic nerve. The brain is saying SNS, vasoconstrict, vasoconstrict. So this blood vessel is getting the signal from its neural innervation to get smaller. But the metabolically active skeletal muscle fibers and the CO2 and the potassium and the lactate coming out send a signal to cause vasodilation. And of the two, the local system wins. And they override the system, and they basically block out the sympathetic signal. And this is now understood to be the physiological process that they observed in that original forearm blood flow study, where it blew people's minds that you'd actually see a decreased blood flow to a skeletal muscle when that tissue is quiet and the body is exercising somewhere else. That tissue is getting the big sympathetic nervous system signal, but there was no local system to override it. When they started having them do forearm exercise and the local tissue started to produce all these metabolic byproducts, but boom, the blood vessel gets overridden with vasodilator signal, and we get to open up the faucet right where we need it. And all of this delivers more blood flow, which, why is blood flow important? Blood flow carries the oxygen. And the oxygen that gets delivered to your mitochondria is what is used to make the most efficient, largest amount of ATP. It also has a huge role in clearing a metabolic waste as well. But a lot of times in exercise physiology, we're really focusing on how we can deliver more oxygen. Because if you can deliver more oxygen more effectively, you will be able to get more ATP. If you have more ATP, you should be able to get more out of that skeletal muscle during the exercise. Okay, so warm up, providing a time for a warm up gives you activation of your sympathetic nervous system, right? Gives your heart a chance to get going and get to its place where it's got a big old cardiac output to help you. It gives you your bronchi and openings so you can get air in and out more effectively. You have stimulated the process of local blood flow, so you're delivering more blood to the area. The next thing that warm-up does is actually in the name. Doing that early bout of lower intensity exercise generates heat. Quick note, let's just take a step back. I think you guys all believe me that you probably get heat, but where does that heat come from when you're exercising? What's actually the source of the heat? Well, the first law of thermodynamics says that energy cannot be created or destroyed. It's just transferred from one form to another. And so when you exercise, there is the thermal energy of metabolism. When you have the cellular events of energy metabolism, heat is released. So when you're making all of that ATP, it is not a purely efficient process. Heat is released, and it's released into your body. There's also the frictional heat of skeletal muscle contraction. Just like taking your hands and sliding them back and forth to each other, you generate heat between your hands. Those sliding filaments of muscle contraction creates a frictional heat within the muscle. The third source of heat is that increased blood flow. Our blood carries a lot of heat in our body, and that increased blood flow to the skeletal muscle helps to deliver heat to the area. So how does heat help? I'm saying it like it's a good thing, but what does it actually do for our patients to have the muscle hotter by the time they get to the conditioning part of their exercise? The first thing it does is it helps with injury prevention. A hotter muscle is less likely to get injured. The reason for that is the heat decreases the viscosity of the extracellular fluid to make everything more smooth and move upon each other. It also improves muscle and joint stiffness. So if you are treating anybody who has a stiff joint or hasn't moved a lot, any kind of pathophysiological condition that's decreasing flexibility of connective tissues, heat is your friend. And you guys just went through the physical agents class this summer, where I know you talked a lot about heat them up and then do something with them, right? Hopefully Dr. Starsky pounded that into your heads this summer. Heat them up and then do something with them, because heat is good if you then take advantage of that flexibility of the tissue and the more mobile structures that you have beneath. So the warm-up is the best form of generating that internal heat that can help with injury prevention. The next thing that heat can do is it can affect the enzymes that are involved in the production of force within the muscle. Specifically, let's talk about myosin ATPase. Myosin ATPase is that enzyme that lives on the head of the myosin and it hydrolyzes ATP. When you increase heat, you increase the efficiency of this enzyme. So with heat, you can actually increase the speed of muscle contraction because of the effect on the enzymes that allow you to break down ATP. Increasing heat is going to affect your nerves. When you increase heat, you increase nerve conduction velocity. That means that nerve impulses travel more rapidly. So you can increase the rate of muscle contraction and reaction time simply because the nerve is actually functioning at a higher rate, like getting that signal out to the muscle even faster. This is important, definitely in our neural population. If there's any kind of a disruption between that connection, something slowing down that speed, that warm-up is critical because if you can increase the heat of the nerve, you can increase the conduction velocity. Increasing heat can actually help increase oxygen delivery. So we increasing blood flow, and then by increasing the heat, we can actually deliver more oxygen. So the technical term for this is that you can increase the arterial venous oxygen difference, or the AVO2 difference. I find that for whatever reason, this is a concept that students struggle with. So I'm just going to walk you through it a little bit in kind of a simple way. So in this diagram, the orange here is the artery. Okay, so the artery obviously has more oxygen because it's fully oxygenated blood that went to the lungs and now is being pumped out into the periphery from the left side of the heart. So in this artery, we can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 oxygen molecules, right? 6 oxygen molecules are being delivered into this capillary bed where they can diffuse out into the muscle if needed, or they can just go along for the ride and they can get pumped all the way back out on the venous side. So if we follow this blood, all of a sudden we're coming out here on the venous side, and the venous blood that's leaving only has 1 oxygen molecule. So the arterial venous oxygen difference is the difference in the amount of oxygen on the arterial side and the amount of oxygen on the venous side. And from this simplified version, you can see that this muscle bed right here just received 5 oxygen molecules, right? Because 6 came in and only 1 left. That is the arterial venous oxygen difference. And the ability to deliver more oxygen is the ability of heat to allow more oxygen to leave the artery as it goes, the capillary, as it goes through that muscle. So let's look at how we can change oxygen extraction. So this is again the oxygen dissociation curve. If you remember from Huenfus and PathoPhys, this is a curve that shows how well oxygen stays bound to hemoglobin. So here you have percent oxygen saturation on the Y, and this is the oxygen partial pressure on the X. At rest, the partial pressure in our skeletal muscles is around 40. So this is pretty much our resting value if you follow this line down. So if you look at the percent of oxygen saturation of hemoglobin, the blood leaving the skeletal muscle at rest has almost 75% of the oxygen still in the venous blood. So the AVO2 difference at rest, here's the arterial amount of oxygen. And if you look at this, this is the AVO2 difference at rest. It's not a huge amount leaving the blood because your skeletal muscle is quiet. It doesn't have a big need for oxygen. So what we're talking about here is how do we increase oxygen extraction? The simplest and easiest way to think about it is simply to know that when the skeletal muscle starts, it's not letting me get other pen colors. Here we go. What color would show up here? Let's do green. When the skeletal muscle starts to exercise, it's going to decrease the partial pressure in the skeletal muscle. It's going to be using oxygen up. So now we see PO2 during exercise is much lower. Ooh, where's exercise? So if you remember, we're on this linear part of the curve, and just by decreasing the partial pressure by just 20 millimeters of mercury, because the skeletal muscle is consuming more of that oxygen, making ATP, we have a huge drop off, right? So just by using more oxygen and lowering the partial pressure, we see a huge increase in the AVO2 difference. As the partial pressure in the peripheral tissue goes down, hemoglobin is more likely to release oxygen. So all by itself, just using up peripheral oxygen, a drop in PO2 will help you deliver more oxygen. But we're talking about heat here, right? We're saying, how does heat help in increasing oxygen extraction at the muscle? And that is because this curve has a rightward shift known as the Bohr effect. So the Bohr effect is shown in this picture as this dotted line, and it is the effect that different factors have on hemoglobin that actually make hemoglobin less likely to hang on to oxygen. So there's a rightward shift because when the Bohr effect is in place, hemoglobin is less likely to hang on to oxygen. And things that cause the Bohr effect: increases in carbon dioxide, acidity. These are all things that occur when we're using the muscle at a high level. We produce CO2, we start making lactate, which is an acid. BPG is a byproduct of some of the glycolytic enzyme. But another big one on here is temperature. So as you increase the heat, hemoglobin is more likely to let go of oxygen. So if we started just looking at rest, right? So at rest, we said almost 75% is still saturated on hemoglobin when it leaves the muscle. By simply heating up the hemoglobin, we can drop the amount off by like another 25%. Still at the same partial pressure of oxygen at 40. The Bohr effect means you will drop more oxygen off. Hemoglobin has a lower binding affinity. But that it gets even more dramatic with exercise because you have the Bohr effect plus you have a drop in the partial pressure of oxygen at the muscle. So you have a decreased affinity plus you're shifting over into these lower partial pressures because you're burning through oxygen as you're making ATP. So where in the previous slide we showed, wow, just by lowering PO2 you have this dramatic effect, it gets even more dramatic when you have the Bohr effect on top of it, and you can deliver almost all, right? We're getting way down. Hemoglobin is almost completely dropped off its oxygen when you're at these really high levels of exercise performance. So when you heat up the muscle, you can deliver more oxygen. If you can deliver more oxygen, your body can make more ATP and keep that skeletal muscle machinery going. So when you put this all together, that 5 to 10 minutes of time to do a light to moderate aerobic activity to warm the body up can be critical in patients that have any kind of compromise to their cardiovascular system, any kind of constriction in their pulmonary system, neural impact that might be slowing conduction or not having a great connection between the nerve and the muscle, and making your patient ready when they start the full exercise of their PT prescription to have greater viscosity, greater flexibility, less likely to injure a joint that might be in a compromised state because of the cumulative effects of activating the sympathetic nervous system, increasing the heat in that muscle, and delivering more blood. We're going to wrap this video up here so that these kind of keep into smaller chunks, and we'll jump into the meat of the prescription at the next lecture.